You might not have noticed if you weren't paying close attention, but almost everything we've read so far this semester has been written in verse. The reason you might not have noticed this fact is that these poems aren't much like what we tend to think of as poems today. We're much more familiar now with short poems dealing with emotional issues, usually referred to as lyric poems, than we are with long epics or poems of social commentary. Lyric poems did exist in the Middle Ages. There are several in your textbook, in fact, if you'd like to read them. But the 16th century, after the medieval period ended, saw the flowering of lyric forms in a way not seen during the medieval period. The one poetic form which had the greatest success in this period was one developed a few centuries earlier in Italy, the sonnet, a 14-line poem with an intricate rhyme scheme. In the 16th century, several important English poets tried their hand at writing sonnets, and the results were so popular that the sonnet form became one of the standard ways of writing English poetry, and actually it remains so even now. To understand how the sonnet developed in England, we first need to turn to its historical background. First developed by an unknown court poet in Sicily, this form attained great popularity only after it was taken up by the great 14th century Italian Francesco Petrarch. Petrarch sonnets were very popular in Europe during the Middle Ages. They were almost certainly known in England by the time of Chaucer, for example. Petrarch used a standard poetic structure for his sonnets, divided into a group of 8 lines, called an octave, and another of 6 lines, called a sestet. The key to this grouping is the rhyme scheme. The 8 lines of the octave rhymed together, usually in the pattern A, B, B, A, B, B, A. In other words, lines 1, 4, 5, and 8 ended with the same sound, that's the A rhyme, and lines 2, 3, 6, and 7 ended with a different sound, the B rhyme. I think this way of talking about rhyme scheme, which is often a little confusing to students at first, will make a lot more sense in a few minutes when we look at some individual poems. If we look at the whole poem, then, one of Petrarch's sonnets, the most common structure for one of his sonnets would be A, B, B, A, B, B, A, C, D, E, C, D, E. In other words, in the sestet, lines 9 and 12 would rhyme together, lines 10 and 13, lines 11 and 14, etc. Now, the reason I haven't yet shown you one of Petrarch's sonnets, which is probably a little surprising to you, is that they're all in Italian. And if I translated them, you wouldn't be able to see the rhymes, since the rhymes are all in the original language. Instead, I'll give you an example of a 16th century English sonnet, which is one found online as well, just coincidentally adapted from one of Petrarch's. This is by Sir Thomas Wyatt, and it's usually referred to as the long love that in my thought doth harbor. And if you look at this particular poem, you can see that the lines 1, 4, 5, and 8 all end with a sort of sound, harbor, banner, suffer, displeasure, while lines 2, 3, 6, and 7 all end with the ence sound, residence, pretense, negligence, reverence. So that's where we get A, B, B, A, B, B, A. And then the last 6 lines have a slightly different rhyme scheme. In this section, lines 9, 11, and 12 all end with a similar sound, a C rhyme we'll call it, and lines 10, 13, and 14 all end with a similar rhyme. And that last line, 14, probably doesn't look like it rhymes with lines 10 and 12, but in the 16th century, cry, die, and faithfully would have all had a very similar ending sound. Now, if you were paying attention to this rhyme scheme and comparing it to what we talked about a minute ago, you may have noticed that Wyatt doesn't follow Petrarch's normal structure exactly. The octave has the same structure as a Petrarchan sonnet, but the sestet's a little bit different. And in fact, we see that throughout the 16th century, that the sestet, those last 6 lines, English poets will use slightly different rhyme scheme there. But still we see a break. That's the important thing. A break between the first 8 lines, which all have some rhymes in common, and then the last 6 lines, which all have some rhymes in common. And if this rhyme scheme is original to Wyatt, the content of the sonnet is pure Petrarch. First of all, Wyatt's sonnet, like virtually all of Petrarch's, deals explicitly with love. And surprisingly, that's a subject matter we haven't seen much reference to so far this semester. More specifically, these sonnets usually dealt with what critics refer to as courtly love, which is a kind of idealized, worshipful love, and we often see that in Romantic poetry still today. In this poem, Wyatt describes the boldness of his love for his lady, which lasts only until his lady expresses displeasure at that boldness, at which point he loses his confidence and becomes meek again. This kind of love from afar occurs throughout the poetry of Petrarch, and then, by extension, the poetry of Wyatt as well. Now, to Wyatt's sonnets, we can compare the sonnets of his good friend Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, usually referred to just as Surrey. Now, Surrey also translated the same sonnet of Petrarch's that Wyatt did, but his translation is a little bit different. His reads, "Love that doth reign and live within my thought, and built his seat within my captive breast, clad in the arms wherein with me he fought, oft in my face he doth his banner rest. But she that taught me love and suffer pain, my doubtful hope, and eke, or also, my hot desire, with shamefast look to shadow and refrain, her smiling grace converteth straight to ire. And coward love then to the heart apace taketh his flight, where he doth lurk and plain, his purpose lost, and dare not show his face. For my lord's guilt thus faultless bide I pain, yet from my lord shall not my foot remove. Sweet is the death that taketh end by love." Now, though these poems that we've looked at share the same original inspiration, the specific language obviously differs. More importantly, however, the rhyme scheme of the poem is different in Surrey's version. And it's not just a difference like we saw with the Wyatt version where there's some slight difference in the sestet, but rather the structure of the poem is starting to change here. The scheme of Surrey's poem, if you look at it, you can see, would be A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. And I'm fudging a little bit here. Obviously, in this poem, the C and F sounds, the ain sound we see in pain, refrain, and then plain and pain, are obviously the same sound. So I could replace F with C again. But the scheme that I just outlined for this poem is actually the scheme that we see in almost all of Surrey's sonnets. But, so what? You probably are asking. Does it really matter in a sonnet which sounds rhyme with which sounds? And what I'm going to talk about over the next few minutes is the idea that sometimes it does matter. In these two examples, the meaning of the poem is not noticeably affected by the rhyme scheme. On the other hand, the basic structure of the Petrarchan sonnet, an octave followed by a sestet, is completely altered in Surrey's version, where the poem consists of 3 sets of 4 lines, A, B, and then C, D, etc., followed by 1 set of 2 lines that rhyme together. In literary terms, we say that the sonnets of Surrey contain 3 quatrains. A quatrain is a group of 4 lines that rhyme together, and 1 couplet, a group of 2 lines that rhyme with each other. In the long run, Surrey's form proved more popular with English authors than Wyatt's did. The kind of sonnet that Surrey wrote is now known as an English sonnet, as opposed to the Italian sonnet form favored by Petrarch and followed, more or less, by Wyatt. And this point can also be sometimes confusing to students. Even though Wyatt wrote in English, even when he wasn't translating Petrarch's Italian sonnets, the form that he's using, that form of 8 lines rhyming together with 6 lines, followed by 6 lines rhyming together, that form is known as an Italian sonnet, no matter what the nationality of the person writing the poem is. Now, the English sonnet became very popular in the 16th century, but it did not make it through the century without some variation, however. Some authors still experimented with alterations in the basic structure of the sonnet. The most famous examples of these experiments are the sonnets of Edmund Spenser. Now, Spenser is a very famous poet, more famous, he used to be more famous than he is now. He's most famous for his epic fantasy, The Faerie Queene, which we're not reading, and for which you can thank me. Spenser, when he wrote his own sonnets, he kept some of the innovations of Surrey, but went even further in developing alternate rhyme schemes. One of my favorite sonnets by Spenser is Sonnet 64 from his collection known as the Amoretti. And I have the sonnet here, and hopefully you've already looked at it. I don't want to read it all aloud, mainly because the pronunciation is really strange in this poem. But despite this sort of archaic language and spelling, I think we can see a change in the form of the sonnet in this example. Now, Spenser's rhyme scheme here is really odd. If we look at the rhyme, we see found. We always give the first line an A in the rhyme scheme. And then flowers would be a B rhyme. And then around rhymes with found. And bowers rhymes with flowers. So that's more A, B. But then in the line 5, we still are with the flowers rhyme. So we're going to call that B again. And then red would be a C rhyme. the next line, line 7, Bellamours rhymes with flowers, would be a B rhyme again, and then C. And then look again. Now we're back in line 9 where we usually see a shift. We're back to C again, bed rhyming with spread and red. And then a new rhyme, line D, we can call this D in the rhyme scheme. Then back to C, then D, and then finally E and E. Spenser's form here, even though it consists of 3 quatrains in one couplet, like Surrey's does, it's much more complex than Surrey's form, mainly because some of the rhymes are carried over from one quatrain to the next. So the B rhyme from the first quatrain becomes the starting rhyme in the second quatrain, and then the C rhyme from the second quatrain becomes the starting rhyme in the third quatrain. Because Spenser's form is unique to him in the 16th century, no other poets at the time were using this rhyme scheme, this form has become known as the Spenserian sonnet, and it usually follows the rhyme scheme we see in this poem. But while the form of the Spenserian sonnet was a significant innovation, the subject matter, as you can see from this example, is straight out of Petrarch. Here, the woman is described in head-to-toe comparisons which point out her absolute and perfect beauty. Now, this kind of comparison, looking at the individual physical features of a woman, usually starting at the top of her head, moving down, was so conventional, so widespread in sonnets of this period that it actually has a literary title. It's known as the Petrarchan conceit. A conceit is simply an extended metaphor in which someone or something is compared to several different things. In the Petrarchan conceit, the thing being described is almost always a woman, and the comparisons are almost always between parts of her body and other very beautiful or pleasant things. So in Spenser's poem here, we see parts of the woman's body compared to flowers. If you read enough sonnets from the 16th century, you begin to get the idea that all of the authors were dating the same woman, since she was always described as having red lips, rosy cheeks, sweet breath, white skin, etc., etc., etc. But something happens late in the 16th century. If we want to see a different take on the traditional love sonnet, all we have to do is look at Shakespeare's sonnet. Now, we're not surprised to see Shakespeare being innovative here, but the way he changed the sonnet form is really remarkable. If we look at Sonnet 130 from Shakespeare, which was written about the same time as the Spenser sonnet above, I think we'll see something very different. And I am going to read this one aloud because it's one of the more famous sonnets ever written. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun, and dun here means dark. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfume is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. Now in this sonnet, Shakespeare is consciously playing with the conventional Petrarchan conceit. He points out that the kinds of comparisons usually made in love sonnets are completely unrealistic. What he's saying here is that his mistress does not have skin as white as snow or cheeks as red as roses. But the reason she doesn't is because nobody has skin as white as snow or cheeks as red as roses. So it's important not to be misled by Shakespeare's initial metaphors. Sometimes students read this poem and tell me that he's describing his mistress as ugly, and I don't think that's true at all. I don't think he's trying to insult his lady's beauty or complain about her looks. Rather, he wants to describe her in real human terms, instead of the superhuman and, of course, unattainable terms normally used in sonnets. In other words, what Shakespeare's saying here is, my mistress' eyes are bright. Are they as bright as the sun? No. Her skin is white. Is it as white as snow? No, of course not. It's human skin, not something supernatural. Rather than being a false, unreal, poetic object, in other words, his mistress is a living human woman. She walks, as he says, on the ground, where he can have a real relationship with her. Now, in this way, Shakespeare breathes new life into the sonnet form. He uses his sonnets to discuss a wide range of topics, from the pliable nature of truth to the destructive force of time. And though his sonnets are sometimes about love, Even these poems treat this subject with much greater complexity than any of the early sonnets we've looked at. But Shakespeare's contribution to the form is not limited to the subject matter. You'll look at the structure of Sonnet 130. You'll notice that Shakespeare is following the English sonnet form developed by Surrey. So he's got A, B, C, D, E, F, G, G. But in Shakespeare's sonnets, the structure of the poem is often used purposefully and to great effect. Notice how the last two lines in the sonnet above completely change the meaning of the poem. In other words, if you read only lines 1 through 12 of this sonnet, you might conclude that the speaker doesn't care much for his mistress. The last two lines, the final couplet, subvert that idea, however. They turn that idea on its head, and they reveal the true message of the poem, that real human loves are better than unreal divine ones. Shakespeare often uses poetic structures like this one. For another example, look at Sonnet 129. The expense of spirit in a waste of shame is lust in action, and till action, lust is perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame, savage, extreme, rude, cruel, not to trust, enjoyed no sooner, but despised straight, past reason hunted, and no sooner had, past reason hated, as a swallowed bait, on purpose laid to make the taker mad, mad in pursuit, and in possession so. Had, having, and in quest to have, extreme, a bliss in proof and proved, a very woe, before a joy proposed, behind a dream. All this the world well knows, yet none knows well to shun the heaven that leads men to this hell. Here, in this poem, Shakespeare uses the three quatrains to establish all of the negative attributes of lust. Notice that each quatrain is grammatically self-contained. In other words, normally clauses or sentences end at the end of the quatrain. At the end of the poem, however, is the zinger, the couplet, which points out that despite all of these negative attributes, we all still give in to lust, the heaven that leads us to hell. What I want you to understand is the way the structure of these poems plays a role in determining the effect of the poem overall. Had Shakespeare been writing Italian sonnets, he wouldn't have been able to use the couplet as he has in the two examples we just looked at. The Italian sonnet is well suited to presenting two sides of an issue, one in the octave and the other one in the sestet, but it lacks the dramatic turn of the Shakespearean sonnet, which is the name given to the English sonnet as Shakespeare uses it, because it lacks that final couplet. English authors continued to write sonnets after Shakespeare, of course, and some of them turned back to the Italian form because it suited their particular poetic purpose. But all of them owe a huge debt to the development of the sonnet in the 16th century, to authors like Wyatt, Surrey, Spenser, and most of all to Shakespeare. All these authors manipulated the form of the sonnet and thus allowed it to grow into full maturity. If you have any questions about the sonnet, let me know. Otherwise, thank you and get back to work.